Evelyn sat alone at the small wooden table in her cramped apartment, her hands trembling slightly as she sorted through another pile of bills. The light above flickered, threatening to go out, as if even the electricity had grown weary of staying in her home. A single envelope with the word "Final Notice" printed in bold red stared back at her, daring her to ignore it. She pressed her palms to her eyes, trying to fight the tears, but the weight of her situation pressed down harder with each passing second. She was tired of struggling, tired of feeling like life had singled her out for endless hardship, tired of pretending she was okay when every night she cried herself to sleep. Her job at the small diner barely paid enough to cover food, let alone rent, and tips had been dwindling since the new cafe down the street had stolen half their customers. The calls from creditors came daily now, their voices sharp and merciless, reminding her of every penny she owed. Even her landlord, who had once been understanding, had turned cold. He had given her one final warning. If she didn't come up with the overdue rent within the week, she would have to leave. The thought of losing her home, even this tiny, worn-down apartment, clawed at her chest. It was all she had left. She sat for a long while, her eyes wandering around the room, the peeling wallpaper, the second-hand furniture, the faint hum of traffic outside. It all felt heavier tonight. She wanted to escape, but there was nowhere to go. In that moment of despair, her gaze fell on the old wooden shelf by the corner. Among the dusty books that had belonged to her grandmother, one in particular seemed to almost beckon to her. It was a faded leather-bound book with gold lettering barely visible anymore, The Game of Life and How to Play It by Florence Scovel Shinn. She remembered her grandmother reading from it during difficult times, her voice firm with conviction that words had power, that the universe listened if you spoke in faith. Evelyn had never taken it seriously, dismissing it as old-fashioned spiritual talk, but now, with nothing left to lose, she reached for the book and held it in her hands. The pages smelled of age, but as she flipped through them, something caught her eye. A passage had been underlined in her grandmother's careful handwriting. "Say this psalm with faith, and watch wealth flow in 24 hours." The words struck her like a thunderbolt. Could it really be that simple? She almost laughed at the absurdity. How could a few lines spoken into the air erase debts, bring money, and change her life? Yet the ache in her chest told her she couldn't afford to dismiss it. Skepticism was a luxury for those who weren't drowning. She read the psalm aloud once, her voice barely above a whisper, stumbling over the words. Then she read it again, slower this time, letting the meaning sink into her heart. She closed her eyes and repeated it, clutching the book tightly to her chest, as if it might dissolve into light and carry her away. Her tears began to fall, soaking the edges of the pages, but she kept going. She prayed, not with polished words, but with the rawness of her desperation. She told the universe, or God, or whatever force might be listening, that she was ready to believe, ready to trust, ready to receive. She begged for relief, for a break in the endless storm. She whispered the psalm again and again until her voice grew hoarse, and with every repetition, something inside her began to shift. The crushing weight on her chest eased just slightly. Her breathing steadied. A warmth spread through her body, fragile but real, like the first spark of fire on a frozen night. When she finally stopped, the room was utterly silent. The city outside seemed to fade away, and for the first time in months, Evelyn felt a flicker of peace. She closed the book and set it gently back on the table, staring at the words her grandmother had underlined. The promise seemed impossible, yet in her heart she clung to it. She whispered to herself, 24 hours. Please let it be true. She sat back in her chair, exhausted from crying, and allowed herself to imagine, just for a moment, what it would feel like to be free from this crushing poverty, to open her mailbox and find a check instead of threats, to buy groceries without calculating every coin, to answer the phone without fear of another debt collector. The thought brought a small, fragile smile to her lips. Maybe, just maybe, tomorrow would be different. Her eyelids grew heavy, and though she hadn't intended to, she drifted off to sleep right there at the table, her head resting on folded arms. Dreams soon swept her away, strange, vivid dreams of light breaking through darkness, of rivers of gold flowing through her hands, of her grandmother's voice echoing, "Faith is the bridge. Walk across it." She woke with a start hours later, the first rays of morning sunlight streaming through the blinds. For a moment she didn't remember where she was, but then the weight of her situation returned. Yet this time something was different. The heaviness wasn't crushing. Her heart felt lighter, her chest freer, as though invisible chains had been loosened overnight. She rubbed her eyes and whispered the psalm once more before standing up. She didn't know what would happen. She didn't know if money would magically appear, or if nothing at all would change. But in that fragile dawn, with sunlight bathing her small apartment, Evelyn felt a quiet certainty she hadn't known before, that something had shifted, something unseen but real. And for the first time in a very long time, she allowed herself to hope. The morning air carried a crispness that Evelyn hadn't noticed in months. She pulled back the thin curtains and let the light pour into her tiny apartment. Normally, mornings brought Dread the same routine of checking her phone for overdue notices, counting what little she had in her wallet, and bracing for another exhausting day at the diner. But today felt different. She couldn't explain it, but something deep inside her told her to expect the unexpected. She moved to the kitchen and poured herself the last of the coffee grounds she had been rationing. The bitter scent filled the air, and she found herself humming softly, a habit she had abandoned long ago. She sat back down at the wooden table, staring at the old book of Florence Scovel Shinn's teachings that she had clutched the night before. The psalm she had whispered was still etched into her mind, every word resonating in her chest. She repeated it quietly as she sipped, almost absent-mindedly, but with the faintest spark of faith. Her phone buzzed. She froze. Usually, this was the moment fear rushed in, a debt collector, the landlord, another cruel reminder of her reality. But this time, when she picked up the phone, the screen showed an email notification. She tapped it, and her eyes widened. It was from a freelance agency she had signed up for months ago, but never heard back from. Her heart raced as she read the words. "We have reviewed your profile and are pleased to offer you a project. Payment $900 upon completion." Evelyn blinked several times, convinced her tired eyes were deceiving her. $900. That was more than she earned in 2 weeks at the diner. She read the email again, then again, before finally letting out a shaky laugh that quickly dissolved into tears. She pressed a hand to her mouth, overwhelmed. Could this be coincidence? Was this the start of what had been promised? She whispered the psalm again under her breath, thanking whatever unseen force had listened. By mid-morning, another call came in. This time it was her landlord. Evelyn braced herself, her stomach twisting into knots. She expected anger, threats, the final warning she had dreaded. But instead, his tone was strangely different. "Evelyn," he began, "I wanted to let you know that the housing assistance program you applied for has been approved. I received notice this morning. Your rent for the next 2 months will be fully covered." For a moment she couldn't speak. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She had applied for that program months ago, believing it was a waste of time. No one had contacted her, and she had almost forgotten about it, and yet here it was approved, confirmed, real. Her knees buckled, and she sat down hard on the edge of her bed, clutching the phone to her ear. "Are you sure?" She whispered. "Yes," he replied firmly. "It's official. You don't need to worry about rent until next year." She muttered a thank you, hung up, and let the phone drop onto the blanket. She stared at the ceiling, laughter bubbling up unexpectedly. It felt wild, uncontainable, as though her chest couldn't hold in the joy that was suddenly flooding her. The day continued with more surprises. In the afternoon, she went to check her mailbox, expecting the usual collection of bills. But among them was a small white envelope. She opened it cautiously and gasped. Inside was a check for $250, a refund from an overpayment to a utility company she barely remembered. She held it in her hands, shaking, the numbers staring back at her in bold black ink. 3 separate blessings in less than a day. She sat at her table again, staring at the growing pile of evidence that something extraordinary was happening. The psalm she had prayed was not just words. It was alive, vibrating through her life, rearranging her reality. She felt a strange clarity, as if her grandmother's spirit was there beside her, reminding her that faith is not just belief, but action, a decision to step into the unseen with trust. Even at the diner later that evening, where shifts usually dragged on endlessly, things were different. Customers seemed kinder, tipping more generously than usual. One couple left her a $20 bill on a $10 meal, smiling warmly at her as if they knew she needed it. By the time her shift ended, she counted nearly triple her usual tips. She held the money in her apron pocket, her heart pounding with gratitude. Walking home under the glow of streetlights, Evelyn felt as though she were moving through a dream. The city noises seemed softer, less threatening, as though the world itself was aligning with her. The psalm repeated itself in her mind like a mantra, steady and powerful. She whispered it again, her breath visible in the cold night air, each word strengthening her belief. Back in her apartment, she placed the check, the tip money, and the email confirmation of her freelance job side by side on the table. Tears streamed down her face as she stared at them. This was real. Within 24 hours, the impossible had happened. The cycle of fear and lack was breaking, unraveling thread by thread. She picked up the old book again, tracing her fingers over her grandmother's faded underlining, and whispered, "Thank you." Her chest swelled with something she hadn't felt in years, hope, not the fragile, fleeting kind that crumbles under disappointment, but a living, breathing force that burned steady inside her. For the first time, she believed that she wasn't cursed, that she wasn't doomed to struggle forever. She had opened the door to something greater, and it had answered. That night, she lay in bed, unable to sleep, replaying the events of the day over and over. The psalm echoed in her heart like a melody, lulling her into peace. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew one thing with certainty. Florence Scovel Shinn's words had power, and her life would never be the same again. The following evening, Evelyn returned home with her hands full. Her shift at the diner had ended late, but instead of dragging herself back like usual, she felt as though she was walking on air. Her apron was heavier with tips than it had ever been. Her freelance project was already underway with the promise of quick payment, and the certainty of 2 months' rent being covered lifted the crushing weight that had been suffocating her for so long. She placed her bag on the floor and looked around her small apartment. Nothing had changed. The wallpaper still peeled in places, the old lamp still buzzed faintly, the carpet still bore the wear of time. Yet to her the room seemed brighter, as though the very air shimmered with possibility. She set the money she had earned that day onto the wooden table, the same table where only one night earlier she had collapsed in despair. How different the world looked now. She ran her fingers over the worn surface of the wood and remembered the tears that had fallen there. the whispered psalm that had left her lips like a desperate cry into the void. That void, it seemed, had not been empty at all. Something had been listening, waiting for her to ask, waiting for her to believe. Evelyn sat down, her eyes drifting once again to the old book of Florence Scovel Shinn's teachings. She opened it to the familiar page, the one her grandmother had marked, and whispered the psalm again. This time her voice was not shaky or broken. It carried strength, confidence, gratitude. Each word filled her with warmth, and for the first time she understood. The psalm had not simply brought her money, it had awakened something dormant within her. It was as if her soul had been asleep under the heavy blankets of fear and lack, and now it was wide awake, pulsing with energy. She thought of her grandmother, the way she used to speak with conviction about faith and the power of words. Evelyn had always admired her strength, but never truly believed she could possess it herself. Tonight, however, she felt that strength coursing through her veins. She closed her eyes and whispered a quiet thank you to her grandmother, feeling as though her spirit lingered nearby, proud of her for finally stepping into the flow of faith. The hours passed quietly, but Evelyn could not stop reflecting on how her life had shifted so dramatically in such a short time. She thought back to the hopelessness she had felt, the way poverty had clung to her like a curse, draining her joy and burying her dreams. That curse, she realized, had never been invincible. It had been waiting for her to confront it with belief. The psalm had been the key, unlocking a door she had never dared to open. She wondered how many other doors had been locked inside her life, doors she had never even tried to push against because fear had convinced her they were sealed shut. The next morning, she awoke earlier than usual, her body buzzing with energy. She prepared breakfast with what little she had left in her pantry, but instead of worrying about running out of food, she found herself smiling. She knew more was coming, that provision would flow because she had tapped into something greater than scarcity. She whispered the psalm again over her meal, a blessing not just of survival, but of abundance. She ate slowly, savoring every bite as though it were a symbol of the feast to come. Later that day, while working on her freelance assignment, she received another message, this time from an old friend she hadn't spoken to in years. They had seen her profile online and wanted to reconnect, offering her a potential collaboration on a long-term project. Evelyn nearly dropped her phone in shock. Opportunities were coming from every direction now, as though the universe had been waiting for her to flip a switch inside her heart. That evening she walked through the city with a newfound perspective. The streets were the same, the people hurrying by were the same, but to her, everything glowed with possibility. She noticed details she had ignored before, the kindness in a stranger's smile, the golden tint of the sunset against glass buildings, the laughter of children echoing from a nearby park. For so long, she had been too weighed down by fear to notice beauty, but now her heart was open, and the world reflected her joy back to her. When she returned home, she lit the small candle that sat on her windowsill and whispered the psalm once again. She spoke it not as a desperate plea, but as a declaration of faith. She knew now that it wasn't magic words that brought change. It was her belief, her surrender, her willingness to see beyond the visible into the unseen. She felt peace settle over her like a warm blanket, wrapping her in certainty that she was cared for, provided for, loved. Evelyn sat at the table long into the night, writing in a notebook she had found buried in a drawer. She wrote about everything that had happened, every blessing that had arrived within those 24 hours, every shift she felt inside her spirit. She wrote about her fears too, not to dwell on them, but to release them, to let them drain onto the page so they could no longer control her. As she filled page after page, she realized that she was not just documenting her story, she was rewriting it. The psalm had broken more than the curse of poverty. It had broken the curse of doubt, of hopelessness, of believing she was powerless. She realized that if one prayer, one moment of faith, could create such a transformation, then the possibilities for her future were limitless. She could build a life of abundance, not just financially, but spiritually, emotionally, in every way. By the time she closed her notebook, the candle had burned low, its flame flickering gently. Evelyn whispered the psalm one last time before blowing it out, smiling through tears of gratitude. She lay down in bed, her heart lighter than it had been in years, and as sleep claimed her, she knew with certainty that this was only the beginning. Her life had turned a corner. She had stepped into a flow where miracles were not rare but natural, where wealth was not a distant dream but a present reality, where faith was the bridge that carried her into abundance. And as she drifted into dreams of light and freedom, Evelyn knew that she would never again doubt the power of words spoken in faith. Florence Scovel Shinn's wisdom had not only changed her circumstances, it had changed her, and because of that, her world would never be the same.